The message arrived just before dawn, lighting up my screen with a harsh, unblinking glare that seemed entirely too aggressive for that hour of the morning. It was from Harvey, our seasoned corporate counsel, a man whose resting expression was a scowl and who considered small talk to be a billable offense. "Do not come to the office today," the text read. "You will understand soon enough." There was no punctuation at the end, no emoji, no follow-up explanation. Just those 13 words sitting there in the stark white bubble of my messages, waiting for me to process them. I was standing in my kitchen, barefoot on the cold hardwood floor, the aroma of dark roast coffee just beginning to fill the room. Outside, the world was still wrapped in the heavy, quiet gray of early morning. The neighborhood was silent, save for the distant hum of a delivery truck and the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. But today, the cadence was broken. I leaned against the counter and unlocked my phone again, my thumb hovering over the screen. The notifications had already started. The soft ping of an email followed by another, and then the persistent vibration of the company's internal messaging app. I opened the application and found the general announcements channel glowing with new activity. It was a digital parade of corporate sycophancy, a dizzying array of congratulations and unearned praise. Thrilled to welcome the bold new vision of our leadership. One vice president had written. Excited for the next dynamic chapter under fresh guidance, chimed in a director from marketing. Preston Thorne. The man had never written a line of code, never negotiated a vendor contract, and certainly never spent a sleepless night trying to resolve a critical compliance failure before the market opened. He was the classic nepotism hire, born on third base and convinced he had hit a triple. And now, he had apparently decided that his first act as the visionary leader of Apex Dynamics would be to clean house. I set the mug down, the coffee suddenly tasting bitter on my tongue. My inbox was already filling up with urgent requests from project managers and engineering leads. They were asking for my sign-off on the Phase 3 deliverables for our largest government contract. They were tagging me in threads about vendor access and security clearances. Nobody knew I was gone yet. Or perhaps Preston had simply assumed that my role was just another bureaucratic hurdle he could jump over without consequence. Richard had been a visionary. He understood that a company was only as strong as its foundation, and he had trusted me to pour the concrete. But Richard had stepped back, retreating to his estate in the mountains and leaving the keys to the kingdom in the manicured hands of a son who believed that leadership was about making bold, disruptive moves for the sake of appearances. The phone buzzed again. This time it was a direct message from one of my senior analysts. I stared at the message for a long time. I could have replied. I could have explained that I had been terminated, that my clearance was likely revoked, and that they needed to contact Preston's office for further instructions. But I didn't. I simply locked the screen and set the phone face down on the table. I walked back into the kitchen, the hardwood floor cool against my bare feet. I opened the pantry, bypassed the quick oatmeal I usually ate on the run, and reached for the ingredients to make a proper breakfast. Eggs, bacon, sourdough bread. If I was going to be unemployed, I was at least going to eat well. As the bacon sizzled in the pan, filling the house with a rich, savory scent, I allowed my mind to wander back to the events of the previous afternoon. It was the moment the fuse had been lit. The moment Preston Thorne had decided to showcase his newfound authority in front of the board of directors. He had wanted to make a statement. He had wanted to prove that he was not just his father's son, but a decisive, modern executive unafraid of cutting the fat. He just didn't realize he had cut the spine instead. I flipped the bacon, listening to the crackle and pop of the hot grease. My phone vibrated again against the counter. The inbox count was climbing steadily. 50 unread emails, then 60. The project was beginning to tilt, a massive ship slowly drifting toward the rocks without its captain. And the best part was, they had absolutely no idea how bad it was about to get. Let the ship drift, I thought to myself. Let the alarms sound and the warning lights flash. Preston Thorne wanted to be the captain. Now he could deal with the storm. Conference Room A was the executive showcase, a sprawling expanse of frosted glass, polished mahogany, and austere leather chairs that squeaked uncomfortably if you shifted your weight. The room always felt 10 degrees too cold, designed perhaps to keep everyone alert. When I arrived, the board of directors was already filtering in. These were men and women who had spent their entire careers mastering the art of the neutral expression, their faces unreadable as they took their seats. At the head of the long table stood Preston Thorne. He was dressed in a tailored suit that likely cost more than the average employee made in a month. His pocket square folded into a crisp, aggressive peak. His hair was meticulously styled, not a single strand out of place, and he wore a smile that was entirely too bright for a Tuesday afternoon. He looked less like a chief executive and more like a man playing the role of one in a television drama. Sitting quietly in the corner, far removed from the center of attention, was Harvey. Our legal counsel had a way of blending into the background until he was needed, his presence often overlooked until the exact moment he decides to strike. He had his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes narrowed slightly behind his wire-rimmed glasses, watching Preston with the measured intensity of a hawk observing a particularly foolish rodent. He clicked a remote, and the massive screen behind him hummed to life. The first slide was a chaotic collage of meaningless corporate buzzwords, agile verticals, synergistic ecosystems, and future-proofing the paradigm. It was the kind of presentation you bought from a consulting firm when you had absolutely no original ideas of your own. "We have built a tremendous legacy here," Preston continued, pacing slowly at the head of the table. "But legacy can sometimes become an anchor. We need to be lighter, faster, and more adaptable. We need to eliminate bureaucratic bottlenecks that slow our velocity." I sat perfectly still, my notebook open in front of me, my pen resting on the blank page. I had spent 2 decades building those very bottlenecks. They were not designed to slow the company down. They were designed to keep it from driving off a cliff. We were managing federal contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. You didn't move fast and break things when you were handling secure government infrastructure. You moved methodically, you documented everything, and you made absolutely certain that every single compliance regulation was met. Preston clicked to the next slide. It displayed a simplified organizational chart, a sprawling tree of departments and reporting lines. Several boxes were highlighted in a stark, aggressive red. He clicked the remote one more time. The screen zoomed in on the Compliance and Strategy Division, my division, and there, sitting squarely in the middle of a red box, was my name, Bradley Caldwell. Next to it were 3 words that hit the room like a physical blow: Roll Sunset Recommendation. "Effective immediately," Preston announced, his voice slicing through the quiet. "The position of Operations Strategy Director is being dissolved. We appreciate Bradley's long history with the company, but this restructuring is essential for our forward momentum. The operational oversight will be decentralized and managed by the regional team leads." Decentralized. He was going to hand the keys to the federal compliance vault to a group of regional managers who barely knew how to file their own expense reports correctly. It was a disaster waiting to happen, a catastrophic failure in the making. But looking at Preston's smug, triumphant face, I realized something profound. He didn't care about the risk, he cared about the optics. He wanted to show the board that he was a decisive leader, unafraid to cut a high-salary legacy executive on his very first day. It was a power play, pure and simple. I felt the eyes of the room slowly turning toward me. They were expecting outrage. They were expecting a scene. They expected me to stand up, to shout, to demand an explanation, or perhaps to remind them of the sweat and blood I had poured into the foundation of Apex Dynamics. I did not flinch. I did not frown. I simply reached forward, picked up my pen, and clipped it to the cover of my notebook. I stood up slowly, the leather chair offering a faint squeak in the overwhelming silence. I reached up and unclipped my security badge from my lapel. It was the same worn plastic badge I had carried for over 20 years, the edges slightly frayed. I placed it gently on the polished mahogany table. The quiet click of the plastic against the wood sounded like a gunshot. Without saying a single word, I turned and walked toward the heavy glass doors. I could feel the collective breath of the room being held as I pushed the door open and stepped out into the hallway. I didn't look back. I didn't pack up my office. There was nothing in that room I needed anymore. Everything that mattered was already secured in encrypted backups on my personal servers. The walk to the parking garage was a blur of fluorescent lights and familiar faces passing by in ignorant bliss. The cold air hit me as I stepped out into the concrete structure, a sharp, biting wind that felt incredibly clarifying. I got into my car, started the engine, and just sat there for a long moment, listening to the steady hum of the motor. I wasn't angry. That was the most surprising part of the whole ordeal. The rage I expected never materialized. Instead, I felt a deep, profound sense of calm. It was the calm of a man who knows that he holds the winning hand in a game the other players don't even realize has started. The silence in my house was absolute, the kind of heavy, unbroken quiet that only exists when the rest of the world is frantic and you are entirely removed from it. It was a stark contrast to the buzzing, vibrating chaos that I knew was unfolding miles away in the corporate headquarters of Apex Dynamics. I stood at the kitchen island, a linen apron tied around my waist, meticulously measuring out flour and sugar. Baking was a science, a precise combination of chemistry and patience, and after 22 years of putting out administrative fires, I found a deep, satisfying comfort in something that followed strict, unbreakable rules. I was making a loaf of sourdough, a process that required time, attention, and an understanding of how small actions yielded significant reactions. It was a fitting metaphor for the day. As I worked the dough, kneading it rhythmically against the cool granite counter, my laptop sat open a few feet away. I wasn't logged into the corporate network. My access had been unceremoniously revoked shortly after I handed over my badge. But I didn't need official access to see the pulse of the project. Years ago, I had built a separate, secure diagnostic dashboard, a read-only interface that tracked the major milestones, vendor synchronizations, and compliance check-ins for our massive government infrastructure contract. The inbox counter, tracking messages routed to my now-defunct corporate address, had been climbing steadily since sunrise. It sat at 74 unread messages when I put the dough in a bowl to rise. By the time I had cleaned the counter and poured myself a third cup of coffee, the count had breached 120. I could visualize the panic spreading through the office, a slow-moving wave of realization. It would have started with the project managers. They were the ground troops, the men and women who relied on my authorization codes to move Phase 3 of the contract forward. The system required a dual authentication sign-off from the named Executive Director of Operations for any significant deployment. Without it, the network simply locked them out. A hard stop hard-coded into the architecture to prevent unauthorized alterations to secure federal frameworks. And that was when the terrible truth would have dawned on Preston Thorne. My laptop chimed, a soft, melodic tone that indicated a critical alert on the dashboard. I walked over, wiping a smear of flour from my hands, and leaned in to read the screen. The vendor access logs for the Baltimore server facility had just flatlined. It was happening. The dominoes were beginning to fall. The clause was explicit. In the event that the named compliance officer was removed from the project without a 60-day transition period and written approval from the Federal Oversight Committee, all operations must immediately cease. I watched as the dashboard updated again. The procurement system had frozen all purchase orders tied to the Phase 3 deployment. Down in St. Louis, the engineering teams were suddenly locked out of their secure portals, their screens going dark mid-keystroke. The vendors, bound by their own stringent compliance rules, were legally obligated to pull their personnel from the physical sites the moment the system flagged an unauthorized absence of the key personnel. It was a total, catastrophic shutdown, and it was unfolding exactly as the contract dictated. My personal cell phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a text from Harvey. It was brief, devoid of emotion, and entirely satisfying. I smiled, a small, genuine smile, and typed a quick response. "How is our visionary leader handling the news?" I set the phone down and turned my attention back to the kitchen. The dough had doubled in size, soft and pliable. I punched it down, feeling the satisfying release of air, and began to shape it into a tight, round loaf. I wasn't going to wait by the phone. I wasn't going to pace the floors or bite my nails in anticipation. I had spent 2 decades being at their beck and call, rushing to fix every crisis and smooth over every executive misstep. Today they could wait. Back at the Apex Dynamics headquarters, The atmosphere had likely transitioned from confusion to outright terror. The stop work order wasn't just a bureaucratic inconvenience, it was a massive financial hemorrhage. The terms of the contract were punitive, designed to heavily penalize the company for any delay caused by negligence or breach of agreement. The penalty for an unauthorized halt in Phase 3 operations was staggering. The meter was now running at $150,000 per hour. Every 60 minutes that passed, without my physical, documented presence authorizing the workflow, the company bled another fortune. By lunchtime, they would be down nearly $500,000. By the close of business, the penalty would soar past $1 million. It was a financial wound that could not be bandaged with corporate buzzwords or synergized ecosystems. It required a specific, singular tourniquet, and that tourniquet was currently in his kitchen, waiting for the oven to preheat. I scored the top of the loaf with a sharp knife, creating a precise crosshatch pattern, and slid the baking sheet onto the middle rack. As I closed the oven door, the dashboard chimed again. A priority notification from the client's legal division had been logged in the main system. The formal breach notice had been delivered. Preston Thorne had wanted to make a statement. He had wanted to show the board that he was fearless, that he could carve out the old guard and modernize the company with the stroke of a pen. But in his arrogance, he had failed to do the one thing a competent executive must always do before making a move. He had failed to read the fine print. I wiped down the counters, the scent of baking bread beginning to rise and fill the warm space of the kitchen. The house was quiet, peaceful, and entirely under my control. Out there, the corporate empire was burning, and the arsonist was just now realizing that he had locked himself inside the building. Let it burn a little longer, I thought. Let them feel the heat. Only then would they truly understand the value of the man who knew where the fire extinguishers were kept. Harvey sat in his usual corner, his hands folded neatly on top of a plain manila folder. He didn't speak immediately. He let the silence stretch, forcing Preston to endure the suffocating weight of his own failure. When the quiet became unbearable, Harvey finally cleared his throat, the sound sharp and authoritative in the still room. "It is not a temporary operational delay," Harvey said, his tone devoid of any sympathy. "It is a catastrophic breach of contract. We have been issued a formal stop work order under Federal Acquisition Regulation Clause 52.242-15. Preston swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the lawyer. "Right. Well, I've already directed Human Resources to fast-track a replacement candidate. We can have a new director named and submitted for approval by the end of the day." Harvey slowly unclasped his hands and opened the manila folder. He slid a single, highlighted page across the polished wood of the table. "You clearly did not read the continuity agreement before you executed your strategic restructuring," Harvey stated, the words biting and precise. "The client requires a minimum 60-day transition period, accompanied by written authorization from the Federal Oversight Committee before any change to key personnel can be recognized. You fired the only man authorized to run Phase 3, and you did it without a contingency plan. The system is entirely locked down." A low murmur rippled through the board. A senior director, a woman known for her ruthless financial acumen, leaned forward. "Harvey, what is our immediate exposure here? What are the penalties for this halt?" Harvey didn't look at Preston as he answered. He kept his eyes locked on the director. "The punitive damages outlined in the Phase 3 agreement are severe, designed specifically to deter exactly this kind of negligent disruption. The penalty for an unauthorized cessation of work on a secure federal infrastructure project is $150,000 per hour." The number hit the room like a physical shockwave. Several board members gasped, and one man actually dropped his pen, the clatter echoing loudly in the tense space. "$150,000 an hour," the financial director repeated, her voice turning icy. "Every hour? From the moment the order was issued?" "Correct," Harvey replied calmly. "The order took effect at precisely 8 o'clock this morning. As of this exact moment, the company has accrued $600,000 in unrecoverable fines. By the close of business today, that number will exceed $1.2 million. It will continue to compound until the named key personnel is physically reinstated and authorized in the system." Preston's face had drained of all color. He looked like a man who had stepped off a curb and suddenly realized a freight train was bearing down on him. However, "But that's absurd," he stammered, pointing a shaking finger at the document on the table. "We can dispute that. We can claim it was an internal administrative error. We can call their legal team and explain the transition." "I have already spoken with their legal team," Harvey countered, his voice rising just enough to cut Preston off completely. "They are not interested in our internal administrative errors. They are interested in continuity and security. They made their position abundantly clear. Either Bradley Caldwell is reinstated with his full original authority, or they will terminate the $900 million contract entirely for cause." Before Preston could formulate another defense, the heavy doors of Conference Room A swung open. The room collectively held its breath as Richard Thorne walked in. The founder of Apex Dynamics had been thousands of miles away, attending an infrastructure summit in Geneva when the alert hit. According to Harvey, Richard had walked out of his keynote address mid-sentence, boarded a private flight, and flown straight back to manage the crisis his son had engineered. Richard looked exhausted, his suit rumpled from travel, but his eyes were sharp, cold, and entirely focused. He didn't greet the board. He didn't offer apologies. He walked slowly the length of the table until he stood directly across from his son. Preston shrunk back, a primal defensive posture as his father looked at him. "Dad, I can explain," Preston said, his voice cracking. "I was trying to streamline the department. The metrics showed." Richard raised a single hand, and the room went dead silent. The founder didn't yell. He didn't slam his fist on the table or launch into a tirade. Instead, he leaned forward, his voice a low, terrifying whisper that carried into every corner of the room. "You cut the spine out of my company to make yourself look tall," Richard said. The disappointment in his voice was far worse than any anger could have been. "What have you done?" Preston opened his mouth, but no words came out. The visionary leader, the man who had confidently sunsetted my role 24 hours earlier, was reduced to a frightened boy standing in the wreckage of his own arrogance. Richard turned to Harvey, dismissing his son completely. "What is our path to compliance restoration? How do we stop the bleeding?" "There is only one path," Harvey answered steadily. "We must reinstate Bradley immediately. We must formally retract the termination, restore his access, and inform the client that he is back in control of Phase 3. Richard closed his eyes for a long moment, taking a slow, measured breath. When he opened them, the exhaustion seemed to weigh even heavier on his shoulders. "Is he willing to return?" Harvey allowed a faint, humorless smile to touch his lips. "He has not explicitly refused. However, considering the public nature of his dismissal, I suspect he will not return under the previous terms." "Get him on the phone," Richard commanded, his voice brokering no argument. "Whatever terms he wants, give them to him. Just stop the clock." As Harvey recounted the meeting to me later, that was the exact moment Preston realized his brief, disastrous reign was over. The board had turned away from him, looking instead to the empty chair where I had sat just the day before. The young executive had wanted to prove his power by firing the most vital man in the room. Now, he was going to have to sit in silence and watch his father pay a ransom to get that man back. I was pulling my fresh golden loaf of sourdough out of the oven when my phone finally rang. I looked at the caller identification. It was Richard Thorne. I let it ring 3 times, enjoying the rich smell of the hot bread and the quiet peace of my kitchen, before I finally reached out and answered the call. I answered the call on the 4th ring, making sure my voice carried the calm, unhurried tone of a man who had nowhere to be and absolutely nothing to lose. "Bradley," Richard Thorne's voice came through the speaker, sounding rough and worn down, like a stone that had been dragged over a gravel road. "I am calling to formally apologize for the incident that occurred yesterday afternoon. It was an unacceptable lapse in judgment by the acting leadership, and it does not reflect the position of this board or the values of this company." He didn't use Preston's name. He called him acting leadership, stripping his son of his identity and reducing him to a terrible administrative error. It was a cold, pragmatic maneuver, but it told me everything I needed to know. Richard wasn't calling to protect his son. He was calling to save his legacy. "I appreciate the apology, Richard," I replied. leaning against the kitchen counter and watching the steam rise off the freshly baked bread. But an apology does not mitigate the fact that my employment was terminated, nor does it resolve the stop work order currently costing the company $150,000 every hour. I heard a heavy sigh on the other end of the line. Harvey has briefed me on the situation with the Federal Oversight Committee, Richard said, getting straight to the point. We need you back in the building. We need you to reauthorize the Phase 3 deployment and stabilize the client relationship. We are prepared to offer you full reinstatement, a 20% increase in your base salary, and a substantial retention bonus to compensate you for the disruption. It was a generous offer, the kind of package that most executives would have eagerly accepted. But I wasn't most executives, and this was no longer about a paycheck. This was about structural control. Preston had proven that the foundation of the company was vulnerable to the whims of an arrogant successor. I intended to permanently reinforce that foundation, and I intended to make Preston pay for the cement. I am willing to return and resolve the compliance breach, I said, my voice steady and resolute. However, my return will not be under the previous terms, and a salary increase is not what I am looking instead. There was a brief pause on the line. I could imagine Richard sitting at the head of the conference table, the entire board of directors listening in silence as the exiled director dictated his terms. What are you looking for, Bradley? First, I began, ticking the points off on my fingers even though no one could see me. I want a formal title change to Executive Director of Continuity and Strategy. Second, I will no longer report to the Chief Executive Officer. My direct reporting line will be exclusively to the Board of Directors. Third, I require a 2% vested equity stake in the company, effective upon my reinstatement. I let the silence hang for a moment, allowing the weight of the equity demand to settle in the room. I was asking for a piece of the empire itself, a permanent seat at the table that could not be revoked by a sudden executive tantrum. And finally, I continued, saving the most critical condition for last. Preston Thorne is to be permanently removed from any operational authority related to Phase 3 or any subsequent government contracts. He will have no access to the compliance portals, no authority to alter project timelines, and no oversight over my department. If these terms are acceptable, I will have Harvey draft the addendum, and I will be in the office within the hour to lift the stop work order. If they are not, I suggest you call your insurance provider. The silence on the line stretched for a long, agonizing minute. I could hear the faint murmur of voices in the background, Harvey advising, the financial director calculating the cost of my demands versus the cost of the hourly penalties, and perhaps Preston protesting his own exile. But the outcome was never truly in doubt. The meter was running, and I was the only man who knew how to turn it off. The terms are acceptable, Richard finally said, his voice stripped of any warmth. Harvey is drafting the addendum now. We will have it ready for your signature when you arrive. I will see you shortly, Richard, I said, and ended the call. I took my time getting ready. I showered, shaved, and put on a fresh dark suit. I selected a tie that was a subtle shade of crimson, a quiet nod to the financial bleeding I was about to stop. I drove back to the office at exactly the speed limit, listening to classical music and watching the afternoon traffic flow around me. I felt no urgency. The panic belonged to them. I only carried the cure. When I walked through the sliding glass doors of the Apex Dynamics headquarters, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The reception area, usually bustling with activity, was eerily quiet. A few junior analysts looked up from their desks as I passed, their eyes wide, watching me like a ghost that had suddenly materialized in the middle of the day. No one spoke, but a collective sigh of relief seemed to ripple through the floor as I walked past. I bypassed my old office and headed straight for the executive suites. The door to conference room A was open, and Harvey was waiting for me at the head of the table. Richard sat nearby, staring blankly out the window. Preston was nowhere to be seen. I would later learn that he had been relocated to a small, windowless office on the 4th floor. His title quietly changed to a vague, meaningless advisory role. He had been effectively exiled within his own father's company. Harvey handed me a thick fountain pen and slid the contract addendum across the polished wood. I read through it meticulously, ensuring that every demand, every clause, and every protective measure had been included exactly as I had dictated. When I was satisfied, I signed my name in sharp, deliberate strokes. "Welcome back, Bradley," Harvey said, a rare, genuine note of respect in his voice. I didn't linger in the conference room. I took the signed contract, retrieved my worn plastic security badge from the table where I had left it the day before, and clipped it back onto my lapel. The familiar weight of it felt reassuring, a tangible symbol of a victory that had been won without raising my voice or losing my temper. I walked down the hall to the main operations hub. The room was a tense, silent cavern of dark screens and locked portals. The engineering leads and project managers were sitting at their desks, watching the red penalty alerts flashing on the main overhead display. When I walked through the door, the room collectively held its breath. I didn't make a speech. I didn't gloat or demand a round of applause. I simply walked over to the primary compliance terminal, the heavy mechanical keyboard waiting in the center of the desk. I entered my secure credentials, scanned my thumbprint, and typed in the complex 32-character authorization code that unlocked the federal servers. The screen blinked, the red warning banners dissolving into a calm, steady green. The network hummed to life, the locked portals reopening, and the vendor systems synchronizing across the country. The stop work order was officially lifted. The bleeding had stopped. I stood back from the terminal, straightening my jacket, and looked around the room. The engineers were already furiously typing, the project managers were back on the phones, and the massive, multi-million-dollar machine of Apex Dynamics was moving again. I turned and walked toward my office, the sound of a company returning to life echoing behind me. Preston Thorne had tried to prove that no one was indivisible, that legacy was just an anchor dragging the company down. But he had learned the hard way that when you cut the anchor, the ship doesn't necessarily sail faster. Sometimes it just crashes into the rocks. I sat down at my desk, the newly signed contract resting next to my keyboard. The crisis was over, the empire was secure, and I was back exactly where I belonged. Only this time I wasn't just the man who built the foundation. I owned a piece of the building,